In early 17th century England, a small group was quietly plotting an escape that was legal on paper but banned in practice. They were the separatist Puritans, society's outsiders, yet rock solid in their faith. They weren't chasing money or adventure. What pushed them out was a persecuted conviction. All they wanted was the freedom to worship God their own way, instead of bowing to the Church of England or the king's religious gatekeepers. Under King James I, these heretics were treated as a threat to the social order. Refusing the state church meant rejecting the king's divine right, and back then, disloyalty to the church equaled disloyalty to the crown, basically treason. Branded as outcasts, they lost the right to preach, gather, or publish. Many separatist ministers were thrown in jail, and their meetings were broken up, sometimes with violence. Squeezed by both religious and political pressure, their gut reaction wasn't to fight, it was to leave. North America wasn't the first place they thought of. Instead, they looked to mainland Europe, freer, though unfamiliar. Their top pick was the Dutch Republic, a young nation that had just shaken off Spanish rule. But leaving wasn't as simple as buying a boat ticket. James I flat-out banned separatists from emigrating, so they slipped underground, using smugglers, fake identities, even hiding among cargo to sneak out. They weren't traveling, they were running for their lives. By 1609, after running a gauntlet of close calls, these separatist Puritans finally set foot on Dutch soil. Their first stop was Amsterdam, arguably the most open city in all Europe at the time, famous for its religious tolerance and freewheeling trade and culture scene. Leiden University was also pulling in religious refugees and cutting-edge thinkers from every corner of the continent. Their real home base turned out to be Leiden, a university town just south of Amsterdam. Leiden had a college, factories, and a looser way of life, perfect as a safe harbor for a small exile community. They started over from scratch. The scholars picked up lecturing or further studies at the university. The craftsmen found work in the textile mills, and anyone without a trade leaned on church mutual aid. Some folks chipped in money, others muscle, and together they scraped through the rough start. But soon enough, reality crashed into their idealism. First up, a double dose of anxiety about faith and identity. In Leiden, no one was hunting them down, yet the sheer breadth of freedom felt overwhelming. The local culture was almost too liberal. Every kind of theology, lifestyle, even moral code was on the table. Their kids stopped shunning outsiders and started joining in Dutch festivals. Watching the next generation grow more Dutch than English rattled the parents. They weren't worried about keeping an English paycheck. They wanted to preserve an English soul. Second, the shifting political scene, both abroad and at home, was nudging them to move on. Here's a bit of context. In 1609, the Dutch and the Spanish wrapped up the first phase of the 80 Years' War by signing a 12-year truce. Fast forward to the late 1610s, and that clock was about to run out. The Dutch were already prepping for hostilities to flare up again in 1621. Meanwhile, the Dutch Republic still had to keep its traditional alliance with King James I alive. Add the looming war, a struggling economy, and growing worry that their kids were turning too Dutch, and the Puritans could see the writing on the wall. They wouldn't be kicked out tomorrow, but Holland was no longer a reliable long-term refuge. They needed a new plan for the future. Across the Atlantic, new developments were making headlines. In 1607, England founded its first North American colony, Virginia. Conditions were harsh, but the English model of colonization was starting to take shape. British investors were putting up capital, Maps of America were selling briskly in London bookshops, and even James I no longer saw colonies as a reckless gamble. Instead, he viewed them as assets the crown could manage and tax. For the separatists, North America offered three clear advantages. First, vast land and nearly limitless freedom. Second, it remained within England's sphere of influence, so their children would not turn foreign. Third, if managed carefully, they could strike an agreement with the king, obtain a legal charter, and leave as recognized pioneers. It seemed like the perfect answer, yet major questions persisted. Who would finance the venture? How would they get there? And how would they sustain themselves once they arrived? They were about to embark on a new gamble, this time wagering on a small but vital cornerstone of human civilization. After deciding to emigrate to North America, the Puritans' first move wasn't to pack their trunks. It was to turn back to the very country they'd escaped, England, and ask for an official permit. The irony was obvious. They had fled oppression, yet now had to seek a signature from their oppressor. Why insist on the king's approval? Survival. 17th century America was no utopia. It was a business venture. If you wanted to settle, trade, claim land, and protect your group from being pushed out by other colonists, you needed a legal charter. Without royal backing, you were pirates. With it, you were legitimate colonists. So separatist envoys set foot in England again. Their counterpart was the London Company, a corporation James I had chartered to run the Virginia colony, much like a state-backed investment firm today. The company sought profits, and at the king's urging, a wider English presence overseas. The Puritans weren't the only ones eager to leave. Many ordinary people, land-hungry, deep in debt, or simply disillusioned, also lined up. They cared little for religious freedom, focusing on land and possible riches. A faith-driven minority thus had to strike a compromise with a profit-driven corporation. Negotiations dragged on. The Puritans wanted a place well north of Virginia, beyond the reach of the established church there. The London Company agreed in principle, but delayed the paperwork. Shareholders squabbled. Some viewed supporting the Puritans as a moral investment. Others saw only political risk. At last, in late 1619, a charter, vague but good enough, arrived. The land lay north of Virginia, outside the existing colonial system. It would soon be called New England. They finally held a ticket to the New World, won through diplomatic maneuvering, financial bargaining, and a hard debate over legitimacy. In the spring of 1620, the Leiden Puritans held a meeting that was anything but a Bible study. The agenda? Make checklists, scrape together cash, and assign jobs. They were getting ready to quit Holland, cross the Atlantic, and start over in New England. Everyone knew this goodbye was almost certainly forever. They split into two crews. The first, young, tough families who could rough it, would go ahead. The rest would stay in Leiden under their older pastor, John Robinson, and keep the congregation running. It wasn't just kindness, it was hedging their bets. If the advance team washed out, the folks back home could regroup. If it worked, the whole flock could move, cutting their ties to Europe for good. Ships were the next headache. They hired two, the now famous Mayflower, a mid-size merchant vessel used to European runs, and the smaller Speedwell, meant to tag along as the nimble sidekick. The plan was simple. Sail together, leave the Speedwell in America as a fishing boat, and send the Mayflower back to England. The following months were a blur. Some families sold ancestral houses, others pawned heirloom jewelry. They bought hardtack, tools, lumber, nails. One group even hauled bolts of cloth to sew or trade. They didn't look like conquerors, just budget-minded pioneers moving house. Then, reality threw a wrench in the works. In July 1620, the Speedwell left Leiden for Southampton to meet the Mayflower. From there, it turned into a total lemon. Leaks, repairs, more leaks, more repairs. Southampton, Dartmouth, Plymouth. It felt like a reluctant coastal tour, and they lost over a month. Finally, the Speedwell was ruled untrustworthy. Rumor had it the crew sick-listed the ship on purpose to dodge the brutal Atlantic crossing. Those who wanted out simply bailed and faded from the story. That left the Mayflower to sail solo with 102 passengers. About half Puritans from Leiden and half colonists hired by the London Company. It was a mixed-bag voyage, and none of them realized they were about to write the first chapter of the American story. On September 16, 1620, a gentle breeze swept through Plymouth Harbor in southwest England as a medium-sized sailing ship eased out of the bay. She was called the Mayflower, yet no one on board felt the least bit romantic. This wasn't a pleasure cruise. They were leaving the country they loved, and that had crushed them, heading for an unknown world. At that moment, they had no idea whether they would live to tell the tale, let alone wind up in the history books. The Mayflower wasn't built for ocean crossings. She was basically a truck with sails, meant for coastal hops and short-haul trade. About 30 meters long and 8 meters wide, 3 masts, slow and heavy. The 102 passengers and roughly 30 crew were jam-packed into low-ceilinged holds, where cargo and bunks blurred together. You could barely stand upright. Add crates of food, tools, muskets, and even livestock, and the place felt like a wooden jailhouse on the move. The opening stretch was calm enough, but midway across the Atlantic, a brutal storm hit. Huge waves pounded the ship. A yardarm snapped clean off, and one deckhand was flung into the sea. He clawed a rope and somehow hauled himself back. The hull listed again and again. Seawater flooded the lower deck. People vomited non-stop. Some started hallucinating. With no GPS, no running lights, and no engine, crossing an ocean in those days was flat out gambling with your life. A few voices begged to turn back. Others insisted on pushing ahead. In the end, they DIY'd a fix, ripping a beam from the cargo rack to splint the broken mast. It wasn't just carpentry, it was a statement. Even if the ship's a wreck, we sail on. Even if we can't see the far shore, we trust it's there. 3 footnotes to history happened en route. One passenger died of a mysterious illness. One crewman also passed away, and a baby was born below decks, history's first transatlantic newborn. The voyage was a mashup of death, birth, and plain old fate. No ceremony, no glory, just crowding, seawater, coughing fits, and whispered prayers at night. What they didn't know was that the storm had blown them off course, steering them toward a place farther north, colder, and even more unfamiliar. Massachusetts. Land ho! But hold the party hats. On 21st November 1620, when the lookout on the Mayflower shouted that classic "Land ho!", the deck didn't explode in cheers. Sure, it was the first green they'd seen in more than 2 months, but there was a catch. The shoreline ahead wasn't the Hudson River mouth, modern-day New York, they'd aimed for. It was Massachusetts Bay, farther north, colder, and completely outside their royal charter. Translation: they'd just parked in a legal no-man's land. Their English patent didn't cover this spot, so there were no land grants, no courts, no paperwork, nothing. On paper, they were free men, which sounds great until you realize it's more like free floating in outer space. No one bosses you around, but no one rescues you either. The London Company colonists on board, the non-Puritan half of the passengers, started grumbling. If nobody's in charge here, why should we take orders from you church folks? The whole venture was one argument away from flying apart. Without rules, how do you build a colony? Cue the on-deck Constitution. The Puritan leaders rolled out a quick and dirty contract so everyone could govern themselves. History knows it as the Mayflower Compact, barely 200 English words, yet the first written covenant for self-rule in North America. Its three main points: still loyal to king and God, but in this place they'll form a civil body politic for faith and common good. Future laws will be made the way the whole group agrees on. Every signer promises to obey those laws and respect the group's authority. 41 adult men signed. In that simple, solemn moment, they locked themselves into a set of shared rules, not enforced by a king, not by the sword, but by consensus. The compact wasn't just the finish line of their voyage, it was the starting line of their life together as a society. In late autumn 1620, the Pilgrims finally set foot on the North American mainland. They christened the spot Plymouth, a nod to the English port they'd sailed from. Reality, though, wasted no time slapping them in the face. This new world had zero plans to greet them with open arms. Historical side note, straight from Mort's relation and William Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation. The ship was already low on fresh water and food, so scouting parties followed native trails and found a few sand mounds covered with mats and wooden bowls. These were Wampanoag burial and storage pits. Desperate, the Pilgrims dug into several graves and took the corn and tools buried inside. From today's angle, that's grave robbing. Back then, when you're starving and freezing, survival trumps etiquette. They quickly set up a self-rule committee, electing John Carver as the colony's first governor. Step one in running their own show. Small teams mapped terrain, felled trees, hunted, fetched water, even test-planted crops. They worked ashore by day and slept back on the ship at night. There were literally no houses fit for sleeping on land yet. Then came an endless, brutal winter. New England's cold was harsher and longer than anything they'd imagined. Snow, cutting wind, freezing rain, plus damp, gloomy quarters bred sickness like crazy. Air below deck turned foul. Food grew rotten or moldy. At the worst point, only 6 or 7 people could even stand. Everyone else was flat on their backs. When spring finally crept in, the body count was staggering. 27 adult men, 13 women, and 10 children dead. Sailors didn't escape either. Half of the 30-man crew perished. Many corpses had to be buried in secret so nearby native groups wouldn't learn how weak the settlement really was. Governor Carver himself died that spring, and William Bradford picked up the baton. Yet even as death stalked the decks, life pushed back. 2 babies were born that winter, one actually on the Mayflower, tiny symbols of stubborn hope. The Pilgrims read the season as a divine test. If they stayed loyal to God, He would chisel their faith through hardship. This land wasn't a promised paradise, it was raw wilderness. But they believed that if they held on long enough, it would become their own Canaan. Let me share a few thoughts of my own. Basically, how a tiny seed of democracy sprouted, growing all the way from the Mayflower to the U.S. Constitution. In the Mayflower story, the real game-changer wasn't an Atlantic storm or a brutal New England winter. It was a single sheet of paper, signed on the ship, the Mayflower Compact. It isn't thick like today's constitutions, but it planted one radical idea. Political power can come from the people's agreement, not from a king's bloodline or a bishop's blessing. And remember, we're talking early 1600s. That was earth-shattering stuff. Back then, Europe ran on divine right kings and church supremacy. Ordinary folks had zero political voice. Yet inside that cramped cabin, 41 regular guys put their names down, promising to follow a social contract they wrote themselves. They weren't drafting a full legal code. They were pledging that in this new land, they'd recognize each other's rights and hold each other in check. That spark of self-government didn't drop from the sky. Puritans had long practiced meeting house democracy in their churches. electing pastors, dividing donations, settling doctrinal spats by vote. Church democracy morphed into town meetings, colonial assemblies, and eventually, independence declarations, the Articles of Confederation, and the U.S. Constitution. Call the Mayflower Compact the fossil embryo of North American democracy. Even bigger, its contract mindset soaked into the American character. It's practically in the DNA. Laws here aren't just tools to boss people around. They're mutual promises. I sign, you sign. We trust each other. We build order. That's why the core American belief is discipline makes freedom. Freedom isn't infinite choice. It's collective action under self-imposed rules. Democracy doesn't mean everyone's a king. It means everyone has a vote and a responsibility. So when we look back at that seaweed-streaked, hope-laden Mayflower, we shouldn't just note its departure port or arrival date. We should remember it as a bold experiment where pens replaced scepters and consensus trumped force. Did it stumble? Sure. Early years were rough, but the freedom plus contract seed it planted eventually bore the fruit of a distinctly American republic. One last twist. That seed